Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another one of our Tring Book Festival evenings. Absolute pleasure tonight to have the incredible Wendy Holden being chatted to by me, sadly, Ben Morehouse.
Here we are.
Here we are. No apologies for my presence. It's I like to hide way over there, but the last time I did this was Jeffrey Archer. That was a pleasure.
I'll try and do better.
Well, he got up whenever I asked him a question and paraded up and down there answering the question. And when he'd finished, he paused for a second and then sat back down and said, "Right, Ben, next question."
Oh, well, Lord, how unsettling.
Exactly. So this isn't the first time I've spoken to Wendy. I had the pleasure with 3 hours' notice to interview Wendy in the summer at a festival called Folk East. And in the 3 hours I had, it was kind of the most extraordinary bit of research and things I had to find out about this remarkable book. So it's an absolute joy to have had more considered time to come up with a few far better questions, I hope, than what we had back then.
I'll let you know.
But anyway, Wendy Holden, you are predominantly a journalist from your career.
Yes, I think once you're a journalist, you stay a journalist your whole life, although actually my full-time job now is writing books. But yes, I was a journalist for 18 years, 10 of those years on the Daily Telegraph, and 5 of those years I was a foreign and war correspondent. And travelled all over and largely spent my time in the Middle East and also covered the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. I spent a year in Romania. I was New York bureau chief for a while. That was nice. Not long enough, but it was wonderful while I did it. So yes, it was rather good. But I left journalism to stay alive and stay married. And as my husband's in the back of the room taking photographs, so I think it worked.
And is there anything from that period that you've sort of taken into where you are now with the kind of authoring you're doing?
Yes, it's really interesting because I think, sometimes your life leads you to something that you were meant to do. And I think this is really true of my writing about World War II. So my background is that my father was much older than all the friends of my father's friends, my friends of my father's. And he'd fought the Japanese in Burma. And he'd had an incredible difficult time out there. And my mother was engaged before she met my father, and her fiancé was killed, shot dead, parachuting into Holland, aged 18. So I grew up with a deep understanding of the horror and the tragedy of war, but also because they were so positive. They were just the most amazingly positive, shiny people who had a lot of tragedy in their lives after that as well, actually. But they never lost hope and they never lost positivity. And the stories that they spoke about of war were the ones that have inspired me ever since, because they taught me to look for the humanity in the inhumanity. And although I've had my own experiences of witnessing war, seeing terrible things in war, things that have scarred me for life, I have a little bit of PTSD. My husband would tell you it's more than a little bit. I've broken his ribs 3 times in the night. I've thrown myself downstairs, out of windows, pretty much everywhere. And we now have to have ropes across the top of the stairs. And that's a legacy of that. But I wouldn't not have done it, because it gave me real insight into what it's like to be in a war zone, to understand the horror of it all, but also to look for those glimmers, those flickers of light that happen at times of great darkness.
The flickers of light within darkness makes me instantly think of your previous book, The Born Survivors. 3 mothers where children were born in Auschwitz. I mean, that's a hell of a place to come from.
Yes.
So
that was an incredible. So that was my first Holocaust book, actually. I'd already started to write books. I'd been writing books when I was still at the Telegraph for a while, and then I left to give up completely and write different books. And as a journalist, every day is different. You're used to writing quickly, 3,000-4,000 words a day. One day you could be on a plane to a war zone. The next day you could be covering Buckingham Palace garden party or a court case at the High Court. And I like that eclectic mix. So my first few books were a real mix. Sometimes it was about a dog, sometimes it was about war, sometimes it was a biography of somebody or a memoir. I did some ghostwriting. And that was all very interesting. But the Holocaust had always drawn me. It was always an area that absolutely fascinated me. I was raised Church of England. I was born in Pinner. We lived in Bushey in Hertfordshire for the first few years of our marriage, so I'm from around here. But I came across this story, and it was 3 young mothers who hid their pregnancies from the Nazis and gave birth in the camps. And they all passed through Auschwitz, but the babies were born. One was born in a factory in Freiburg in Saxony. One was born on a train in the middle of a deluge in a coal wagon. And the last baby was born at the gates of a camp in Austria called Mauthausen. And all 3 mothers and all 3 babies survived, which was incredible because the mothers weighed 70 pounds at full term, 5 stone. And had endured 7 months of slave labour and near starvation. And the babies, when they were born, all weighed less than 3 pounds, and their skin was breaking down. They were in terrible condition. But incredibly, they survived, even though almost every other member of their family perished, including the babies' fathers. And it was such a privilege to be able to come across that story. The untold stories is what I'm always looking for. And I came across it by chance and found one of the babies, Eva Clark, who I was speaking at Wickham High this morning. We spoke to 400 students this morning. Eva is 80 and still travelling with me and talking. And she and the other 2 babies survived and went on to have incredible lives. And then because of the way the publishing works, you quite often, if you write in one genre, publishers and agents and other people then come to you and offer you books in the same genre. And so the next book I wrote was called 100 Miracles, and that was the true story, the memoir of a remarkable survivor called Zuzana Ruzhishkova, who lived in Prague. She was 90, tiny like a bird. She just was the most marvelous woman, and she had been a child musical prodigy, a teenager, and survived 3 camps with her mother, ending up in Bergen-Belsen. Again, like the 3 mothers, they'd lost pretty much every other member of their family. And when she came out of the war with her hands almost fossilized from slave labor, she lost all her fingerprints. And she was going to have to go back to grade 1 piano, having been destined to have a career as a great concert pianist. She tried to kill herself. Unfortunately, she was found, and her mother convinced her that music was her salvation. So she went back to grade 1 piano, and she ended up becoming one of the world's leading Baroque musicians, and the only person still ever on the planet to record the entire keyboard works of Johann Sebastian Bach, because the music of Bach had kept her alive in the camps. She said that as long as she had his music in her head, there was still some beauty in this world. And I worked with Zuzana for a long period of time, going back and forth to Prague, and I left her finally on a Friday, and she died on the Tuesday. She never even saw her book published, but her family told me that she stayed alive just long enough to tell me. And it was her, Zuzana, that first ever told me about the person I'm writing about now, or have written about today. And that was a wonderful introduction, because these books find me. You know, they just find me. It's not necessarily that you sit down and think, oh, I'm going to write another Holocaust book. What am I going to write about today? They come to you in some almost magical way. Finding Born Survivors was just me reading a chance obituary about a woman who'd been in Auschwitz, whose baby had been taken away and murdered. And then she had gone on to have a wonderful life. She survived and had borne witness her whole life. And it occurred to me reading that obituary that I'd never read anything about babies that had survived before. And that's what led me to find Eva Clark. And then Eva Clark led me to Zuzana, and Zuzana led me to the Teacher of Auschwitz. So there are happenstances that happen. And I always think that I'm drawn back again, time and again, to war. And I was interviewed for a podcast recently by a psychotherapist. And she said to me, are you drawn back to war because it's healing for you? And I don't know about that. That's a bit too deep for me. I don't know. I mean, I'm drawn to a great story. I'm a storyteller. And that's what appeals to me most. And these are great stories. And especially when they've gone untold for 70, 80 years. That's what really appeals to me, to be able to bring those stories to light. And especially to talk in schools. It's really important, our school talk work, because it's so important to teach children today that these things matter, especially at the moment. That they really matter, that you learn to have compassion, tolerance and understanding and a respect for difference. And this is what happens if that's left unchecked. This is what happens if hate speech goes unchecked. And that's what I find so rewarding about the work. So I think I was just destined to be here for it.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
So let's start talking about Fredy. You've given us a beautiful preamble. It's actually question one. We're already 10 minutes in. So,
Sorry.
but what drew you to Fredy in the first place?
Well, Susanna had 3 photographs on her desk. One was of her father, who had died in a ghetto in Czechoslovakia called Terezin. He died needlessly. One was of her mother, who had survived with her but was very damaged by the war. And the third was this photograph of this beautiful man, gorgeous man. And I thought, goodness me, who is that? Is that a brother? Is that a lover? Who could that be? And I asked her about him, and after months of
show it to the virtual audience.
After months of being with her and really having, some very harrowing, very emotional, very moving conversations, she looked at me and she said, "That is Fredy Hirsch." And her whole face lit up. It was as if a light bulb went on inside her. She was just so enthused. And then she started to talk about him and how incredible he was, and how he had saved her life, how he'd saved so many children, how he'd done the most marvelous things for her and had taught her so much. And I realized, to my astonishment, that here was somebody who had given this woman some of the happiest days of her entire life, and they happened in Auschwitz. And after that, I just had to write him. And also she asked me, she said, "When you finish writing my book, will you please write about Fredy, because he's been forgotten for 80 years. 70 years it was then. I dedicate the book to Susanna, because I wanted her to know that I did actually, I got there in the end, and I did it. And it's now published in 26 countries, so I think she'd be pleased.
I'm struck with why Fredy's story hasn't been told. It's one of my questions for later on, actually, but it now seems like the right time. Why?
Yes, it's complicated, because what happened to that part of the world after the Nazis fell and after the liberators came was that it was taken over by the communists. And the communists were essentially anti-Semitic, they were homophobic. And they were also very keen to round up and actually try and sometimes execute people that they believed had collaborated in any way with the Nazis. And because Fredy was in situations in the ghetto and in Auschwitz where he was having to deal with Nazis every single day to seek to improve the lives of the thousands of children in his care, of course he was collaborating with them. But I think on his own that wouldn't have happened. He happened to be gay, and he happened to be Jewish. So the combination of those three meant that the communists denigrated him, they collaborated him, they claimed he'd had affairs with SS officers, which he absolutely hadn't had, and they burned some of the documents relating to him. So it was a very difficult thing to try and find out the kind of information that I needed to get. I'm a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. When I started writing about the Holocaust, I opened myself up to Holocaust deniers, which continues constantly, daily, to this day. It's something that's very important to me to get everything, get the facts right, and get as much as I could of the story out there.
But this is a piece of historical fiction,
as
opposed to a non-fiction.
It didn't start that way.
Yeah, so you did start thinking non-fiction.
Why
did you make that change?
Because I ran out of material, and I was by then so invested in his story, and Susanna had died, and I wanted to continue with it. And so I just really took this big decision about a third of the way into the book that I would write it. I would switch to fiction and write it as a novel, because actually my non-fiction quite often reads like novels anyway. I try to really bring it to life, think filmically, to bring the characters to life and let you see them and feel them and smell what they're smelling and taste what they're tasting. And so that wasn't such a switch in terms of the narrative style. But of course, what I did have were gaps, and I had to fill in those gaps with fiction characters. But every single character, and I've been completely transparent about this in the back of the book, every single character is listed, all the non-fiction, all the true life ones, and the fictional characters are listed, but every character has been came out of a word or a sentence or a name or some story that I researched over a period of years that was true to the life, and I just literally breathed life into them.
Yeah. How do you balance that kind of the historical accuracy with the kind of with a sort of narrative storytelling kind of? But it's a hard balance, isn't it? It's
a hard balance, and it was certainly one of the most challenging books I've ever had to write, specifically because of that. But I will say that I was very lucky when I'd finished it, I discovered that there was one child survivor left who, I'd already spoken to some child survivors, and obviously Susanna had told me a great deal about Fredy, but there was one left in the world, and her name is Dieter Kraus. And some of you may know her because there was a novel written about her experience, and it was called The Librarian of Auschwitz. And she was the librarian of Auschwitz, working actually with Fredy to keep hold of the few books that they had. And she lived in Israel. She was still alive. She was 96. And I reached out to her and I said, I've written this book about Fredy Hirsch. And her reaction was exactly the same as Susanna's had been. Oh, Fredy, somebody's finally writing about Fredy. How marvelous. Let me read it. Let me read it. And I said, okay, but you need to know it's fictional. I had to fictionalize it because I ran out of information, and let me read it. And I sent it to her. I thought, oh God, she's going to hate it. You know, I've made it a novel. She's going to hate it. And she sent it back to me within 1 week with the following quote: "This narrative is the closest possible anybody who hadn't lived or experienced those times could have possibly written. It will finally do justice to Fredy and all those victims." And it made me cry. It was just so lovely and wonderful. And dear Dieter died last Saturday, aged 96. Wow. So I was so glad that I was able to get that from her and get that endorsement and get other endorsements, and especially from, you know, eminent historians and museums is really important to somebody like me.
Talk us through the research process for a book like this. I mean,
Yes.
where'd you start?
Well, I probably have a better start than most people because, to a certain extent, I'm plagiarizing my own brain. I've written previous books about the Holocaust. I understand about the rise of fascism in Europe. I understand the history. I understand the geopolitics, and I've been to the camps that I'm writing about and the ghettos. So, to a certain extent, I'm drawing on my own material. I'm walking back in my own footsteps. Albeit with a different person, a different character, a different story to tell. And then, of course, it's just an endless rabbit hole of research. I don't know if any of you are aware, but when Steven Spielberg made Schindler's List, it was so successful and he made so much money that he channeled a lot of that money into something called the Shoah Foundation. And the Shoah Foundation's quest was to send people out into the world and find every living survivor of the Holocaust who was prepared to bear witness, to give their testimony, video testimony. And so thousands of interviewers went out into the world in every country, in every language, and got people interviewed and videoed on tape, which has been turned into this massive archive. And for a historian like me, it's absolutely vital. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource. You just have to go to the foundation website, which is on YouTube, and type in, say, the name Fredy Hirsch, and anybody who ever mentioned Fredy Hirsch comes up. In whatever language, and you know, if it looks like a really good testimony, I'll get it translated, and if not, I give the English ones or the French or so on. But it's just fantastic, and again, it was the same thing. Every single one of them, when they mentioned his name, just glowed with happiness, and talked about him. One woman said, "He built a wall against suffering in our hearts," and not just during the war. Afterwards, he built something into them. He was a moral compass, and he gave them tools with which to go on in life and to pass those tools on.
I'm actually conscious that we haven't actually said what Fredy did
Yes.
in many ways.
Can I bring him into the room?
Very much so. This
Yeah.
is an incredibly moving piece of...
This is just the prologue, which is just a page, so
Yeah.
it won't go on too long. My name is Alfred Hirsch, although my friends call me Fredy. Please be so kind as to remember my name. The word Hirsch means stag in German, and like a deer, I've been on the run for much of my life. Today, the hunting of Fredy Hirsch may end in a kill. I'm not afraid for myself, but for the children in my care. They are all I've focused on since the world started burning, and I shudder to think what might become of them. My name is Fredy Hirsch. I am 28 years old. I'm a teacher. I'm a dreamer. I'm not just a number, nor will I be identified by the yellow triangle I've been forced to wear. My name is Fredy Hirsch, and I fought to maintain a vestige of normality and decency in this hellish world. I have loved and laughed, cried and almost died 1,000 times. My name is Fredy Hirsch. I'm a good man. Please be so kind as to remember my name. Oh, what a nice audience you are. You're going to make me cry.
So he found himself in Auschwitz, and obviously the Nazis found themselves with a whole pile of children,
Yes.
aged 0 to...
0 to 16, 16 and above were either sent for slave labor or sent to the gas chambers. He started his work because he was a youth leader. He grew up in Germany, in Aachen in Germany, and he loved the outdoor life, and he joined the Scout movement, and it was all about, being athletic. You can see from his picture he was athletic. His dream actually was to become an Olympian. He wanted to be in the German Olympics, the next Olympics, which were Berlin in 1930s, and of course that was impossible because no Jew was ever allowed by then. But he found great solace because his father had died young, his mother wasn't very maternal, and she rather abandoned him and his brother. And he found enormous solace in athleticism and in scouting and in being a scout leader. He had this incredible capacity to lead younger children, to take care of them, to nurture them, to encourage them to be all the things that he was, to stand ramrod straight and have clean fingernails and your hair neatly combed and your clothing right. And as fascism rose and rose and rose, and it was getting worse and worse for Jews, he rather naively thought that if he got his little charges, marching properly and looking nice and doing a good deed every day, which was the Scout motto, then somehow he'd be able to negate what was happening in the world. And it was too naive, of course, because the Nazis were just sweeping away everything, every right the Jews had. So he started off there, and then he fled to Czechoslovakia because things were getting very difficult. And by then, of course, he was much more in tune with his sexuality, and he realized that he was in double jeopardy for being gay, because gays were also being rounded up and sent to concentration camps, and in some cases being castrated and tortured and executed. So he went to Czechoslovakia, and then in Czechoslovakia they set him up as one of the pioneers sent to the first ever big ghetto in Czechoslovakia, which was called Terezin. And it was there that he really came into his own and looked after thousands over a period of 2.5 years, and created children's homes for them, created discipline, negotiated with the Nazis on a daily basis to get more food for them, better exercise, be allowed to go and do some exercise outside, get some fresh air, try and stop the rampant diseases that were going through the ghetto. And from there he defied orders. He did something that he wasn't meant to do, but he did it on behalf of the children. And for the punishment, he was sent to Auschwitz.
And when he got to Auschwitz?
Yeah, well, one of the great things about Fredy, bearing in mind he was in his late teens and early 20s, and really, I don't understand where the extraordinary part of Fredy comes from. And it's what I like the most about these stories, because all these people, the 3 mothers who gave birth to these babies and then somehow kept them alive and kept them positive and gave them wonderful lives, started off as completely ordinary people. But because of what happened to them and because of the situation they found themselves in, they became extraordinary. And Fredy became extraordinary in so many ways, but what he really became extraordinary was playing the Nazis at their own game. Because he realized 2 things. First was that they really respected and admired physical beauty. And as you've seen, he was physically beautiful. Several SS officers told him, if you weren't Jewish, you'd have made a marvelous member of the Waffen-SS. Because he was perfect, he was Aryan. He looked just like the master race that they were trying to achieve. And so he preyed on that, and he played them at their own game. He addressed them, looking them straight in the eye in a place where everybody else kept their eyes to the ground and didn't make eye contact or draw attention to themselves in any way. He saluted them, he looked them in the eye, he clicked his heels together, and he made demands, and they admired his chutzpah. And the other thing he played on was the fact that he knew how much discipline and order meant to them, that everything was documented, regimented, and they wanted discipline and order. And the one thing you can't get in a ghetto of tens of thousands of people, or in Auschwitz-Birkenau, when you've got children running around, is discipline and order. So he said to them, I'll take the children. There's an empty block down the end of this particular camp. Let me take them. I'll do the roll calls in the morning, because, they're running around and tugging on your breeches with muddy fingers and so on, and they're crying and they want food and they want their mummies, and I'll take them, I'll do the numbers, and I'll feed them. So if you bring me the soup and the ingredients for the soup and the bread, I'll make it there and I'll cook it for them. Oh, and for that reason we need a fire. So can we have the fires lit? And it was the only one in the whole barracks, the whole block, that had fires lit, which was vitally important because that winter was one of the coldest in European history in 15 years. And he just got incremental changes, got more and more and more, challenging them at enormous risk to his own life, because by the time he got to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the person he was challenging on a daily basis was Dr. Joseph Mengele, and he was the angel of death. He was doing unspeakable experiments on children and twins, and Fredy was confronting him every day, demanding things every day, and constantly trying to protect the children from him, because he would come in to the block and give them sweets and tell them to call him Uncle Pepe, and sit them on his knee and play with them. And then 5 minutes later, he'd be at the head of the railway ramp sending maybe 6, 7, 8,000 men, women and children straight to the gas chambers. So it was an incredible thing. Some people have criticized that aspect of the book. They say that I've almost humanized Mengele and some of the SS officers who came into the children's block, but I think I've done the opposite. I think when you see that somebody still has a little vestige of humanity left in them, some sort of idea that human connection and connection with children is a good thing and a nostalgic thing and a nice thing and a reminder of home, and then 2 minutes later they can send thousands to their death unthinkingly, I think that just makes them less human and more evil.
Absolutely. I had the fortune of being taken to Berlin with a friend who's a historian who lives locally, Roger Morehouse, and he gave us some homework to watch films. Downfall was one of them, which is an incredible German film, and the contrast between the good and the bad within a few minutes of each other is extraordinary.
Well, the latest film, the something zone, I can't remember. You'll know what it's called, about the Commandant Huss and him being there. But also, Joseph Mengele's wife came on holiday to Auschwitz. She actually came on her summer holidays and lived in the house that was just within the sight and smell of the chimneys, and she got pregnant there with her son on holiday, and he was so excited because he wanted a son, and he was so excited he was having a baby, but he was sending thousands and thousands to death. Even on his days off, even when his wife was there, he did not miss the opportunity to personally inspect the terrified prisoners that were coming into that camp and deciding who should be sent for slave labor and basically be worked to death. That was their plan. And who should be sent to the gas chambers to be turned to ash. I mean, it's unspeakable and unfathomable. But what is so wonderful about all these books, no matter how awful and harrowing the stories are, is that wherever there is darkness, there is always light. And these little flickers of light spark up and become glowing fires from which everybody else can light something in themselves and can spread it. And the warmth and the glow and the humanity of that is so much more evident, more vivid in a place like that than it would be anywhere else.
I've got so many questions, and I'm looking at the time thinking, blind, where's it all going? Can you describe the block that Fredy created for the children?
Yes, so it was an empty, we call it a barrack, but actually, strictly speaking, it wasn't a barrack. It was originally designed as a stable block. So it was a very, very long building. There are a couple still there at Auschwitz, if any of you have ever been. They've got very high ceilings, and there's no windows in the sides, but there's vents all the way down, which was to allow air to circulate from where the horses had been. And so there's little glimmers of light that come in there, and then there's the main door, and that was it. And of course, they in the ones where people were sleeping, they created bunks for them to sleep in, which you've probably seen, racks and racks and racks of bunks, 3, 4, 5 people in a small space at a time. But this block was left untouched for the children to be in. And very unusually, they had a chimney at either end, a tall chimney at either end, and the flue ran along the floor. It was about as wide as this table and perhaps half the height. And so if you lit a fire at one end and lit the fire at the other, it drew and it went all the way through. And so this thing became warm. This thing that ran the full length of the block became warm. And it was originally designed to keep the horses from these terrible bitter winters that they have in Poland. So the children were having a whale of a time. I mean, they were living in the barracks and sleeping in the barracks in these awful lice-infested conditions and people dying and coughing and and surviving horrible beatings and things happening to them. But they were coming to this little haven every day, and Fredy was able to get a few books, which Dieter Kraus had to hide from the Nazis when they came in. This is all coming from the resistance, who were taking things from the piles of things that people had been sent to the gas, so little extra clothing, maybe a book, maybe something else. And he was able to get some Red Cross parcels and some little parcels of salami and food that were in people's suitcases, because everybody was astonished. Everybody that lived and worked in that camp and had survived in that camp were astonished that children were allowed here. And the only reason children were allowed in this particular block, this particular area of Auschwitz-Birkenau, was because Nazis were terrified the Red Cross were going to come and inspect. So they wanted them to come and see that there were families here and it was okay. But it was always going to be just for a brief period of time, and then they were going to replace them so that they didn't look too sick, they didn't look too unwell. So this block was drab, but Fredy found an artist, Dina Gottliebova, who he'd known from back in Pilsen in Czechoslovakia, and he asked her to paint something on the walls. And the wonderful thing about Dina was that her dream was to become a cartoonist for Disney. And she had seen Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and it was one of the films that all the children saw before the Nuremberg laws came in and prevented them from ever even going to the cinema. But Dina was so determined to see this again and again and again that she hid her yellow star and went to the cinema and watched it 7 times. So she'd memorized almost every scene. So she started off by painting a little Swiss scene, black and white cows on a hill and a little balustrade and some pot plants and things. And then she noticed that the whole place had gone completely silent, and she turned around, and about 500 children were standing behind her, just staring at what she was doing, agog. And she said to them, "What would you like me to paint?" And in unison, they cried Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And of course, it was the one thing she could paint. It was the perfect thing for her. And so she painted that, and it was just the most beautiful thing. And she did survive, and she painted it for Yad Vashem. It's in the museum there, so you can see what she did. But what a lovely thing that they had, whatever else was happening outside, and literally from where they were, when they came to the door, they could see the streams of people being marched to the gas chambers. They could see the smoke. They knew what was going on. They were very well aware of what was going on. But they could turn, and inside there was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And of course, when Fredy started to put on little shows and little plays, the first thing they did was put on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Only there weren't 7 dwarfs, there were about 47, because all the children wanted to be part of it. And he had Dina and Susanna by then. That's how she knew him. She knew him first in the ghetto, and then she knew him in Auschwitz, and she was one of the teenage helpers with the children, and they made little costumes out of rags, out of nothing, out of cardboard, out of old SS forms that had been discarded. Anything they could find, they made little costumes, and the children had this lovely little shows, these little shows to put on, and songs to sing, and places to be and play and forget that outside was death at every turn.
And on that, the SS watched the plays.
Yes, they came.
I mean, that's the contrast of seeing, these people doing the most despicable evil.
Yes.
And yet in tears watching children.
They sat dabbing their eyes. Mengele brought them in, and they sat dabbing their eyes. And word got out to Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, who was Hitler's right-hand man, and he came to the camp specifically to see this children's block, because they were thinking that they might do it in some of the other camps in case the Red Cross chose to sort of spot visit, any of the other camps. And he asked Fredy Hirsch to write him a report on how he'd done it, what he had done, and how he had done. And of course, the last thing Fredy wanted to do was help Adolf Eichmann, or do anything that would make anything happen that might then jeopardize other people or the children. But he was trapped by the situation. And even with Dina, who drew this thing as a favor for him and loved it, and the children loved it. Of course, when Mengele saw it, he realized there was a very talented artist in his midst, and he had Dina paint gypsies for him, because he was so obsessed with genetics. He believed he was going to win the Nobel Prize for genetics. That was his dream. He was going to be this greatest geneticist because he'd found himself in a position where he had an unlimited number of guinea pigs. No matter how many died in his care or not care, under his experimentations or whatever, he could get in more, just bring in more and more and more. And because of this, he would have this incredible resource And even after the war, he sadly was never caught. He drowned in Bolivia years and years later. But even after the war, when people did go and interview him, he had no regrets at all. He said the only regret was that he didn't bring enough of his research papers with him, because one day people would appreciate what he'd been doing.
Blimey. Let's just deviate away. The writing process. I discovered that you'd had the book verified by the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. I didn't realise that was a thing. And what was the importance of having that done? It's
really important, because I get trolled every single day now on social media from people who tell me that I'm a Jew lover, that I made it up, that the whole Holocaust has been made up, that it didn't happen. They bandy this particular figure around. I think it's 271K. And it relates to some random report by the Red Cross that in one particular camp, 271,000 Jews died. And they're saying that they're the only ones that died, and they all died of natural causes. So I need to have backup in these situations. When I go to America now, I need armed protection at the places that I speak, and I'm going back in 2 weeks. It won't stop me going back, and I'll never stop going back, and I can't think of a more important time to go back, frankly. So it's really important for me to have that backup to say not only did Dieter Kraus live it, be there, what was there, but that these really important world-leading historians have read it and fact-checked absolutely every aspect of it and have said this is a remarkable book and absolutely true to life and true to the facts, and it's something that should be read and taken on board. You know, Born Survivors has been adopted for the curriculum for Year 9 and above in this country and in America and across Europe. You know, it's a wonderful thing to be able to write something that means so much to me. I have such passion about it, you may have noticed. And then for it to be embraced in that way, that it can be used as a tool for the future, because long after I'm gone, that book will be there, and that will be a tool for the future. And let's face it, we're losing all the Holocaust survivors. I mean, Eva was with me today, she's 80. She and the other babies will be the last living survivors of the Holocaust soon, because they were born in the waning days of the war in April 1945, and everybody else is much, much older, and they're dropping like flies, sadly, like Dieter.
Yes, I'm conscious. We're going to go to audience questions in a moment, so do think of your questions. Those watching online, can you put your questions into the Q&A box so I can spot them? I know I've got a question here about sort of anecdotes, which I sort of asked you to think about, or detail about children's. That most personified their sort of their resilience, I suppose, more than anything else. Can you perhaps give us a couple?
There's one story, and it's absolutely true. It was in several testimonies, and Fredy was an incredibly strict disciplinarian. If he found anybody stealing anything, stealing a piece of bread, stealing something from within the children's block, no matter how much he might love them, because he remembered them all by name, he was really fond of several of them who became, like Susanna, he was so fond of her and attached to her. But if they were caught stealing, they were sent back to the barracks and they weren't allowed back into the children's block. And so they weren't allowed to lie, they weren't allowed to cheat, they weren't allowed to steal. They were supposed to think of the people around them, and if somebody was really suffering, to help them and to alert him to their own suffering and so on. And there was this one little boy towards the end when things were getting very tricky, and it looked like the Nazis might come and clear out the block. And so they had this idea, because this little boy was so adorable and such a favourite of everybody. And they said to him, okay, so you don't feel very well. We're going to take you to the infirmary. You don't feel very well, because Fredy had contacts in the infirmary, and the infirmary doctors would have kept him away from being purged, if you like, by the Nazis. And this little boy said, but I'm fine. And they said, no, you've got a temperature, you've got a fever, you're not well, you're going to go to the infirmary, If anybody asks you, just say you're not well at all. And he said, I can't do that. Freddie's taught me not to lie.
Oh, bless. Good. So please let me know what your questions are. I've got a roving mic, so I'm going to come running out into you in a second. So you'd put your hands up if...
I stunned you into silence. Hello.
And we've got a virtual audience, so we do need...
Thank you. Hello there. You were talking about the Red Cross, and I just wondered, why would the Nazis have been worried about the Red Cross having come to the camps? Because actually, if they were just casually murdering thousands of people, Why were they worried? What could the Red Cross have actually done?
Well, it would have been, so the Red Cross did actually go to the ghetto of Terezin. They did actually go, after Fredy was taken to Auschwitz, they came. And the Nazis cleared it out of thousands and thousands of sickly people. They literally sent 4,000 to their deaths just because they looked too unwell. And they made sure that only healthy-looking, newer inmates, if you like, were on show. And they made little shops. They created little shops out of houses. They put flowers in window boxes. They created fake cafes where everyone was meant to be sitting, smiling and drinking coffee. Fredy had organised football matches, football leagues, actually, in Terezin, and they put on a football match for them. And they had it all filmed, and they had the Red Cross marching around. They couldn't go off track. They had to stay on this clear path. Children were being given great hunks of bread and butter. Some of these children had never seen bread and butter in their lives, not normal bread like that. They'd never seen it. 4 or 5 years old, they'd been under occupation the whole time. So they were just smiling and happy and photographed. And the Red Cross never went off path. They never asked any questions. And they reported that Terezin was a showcase ghetto and that Jews sent there shouldn't worry about being sent there. And so it was important because, especially in Czechoslovakia, the people that went there were what was called prominenti. They were prominent people, important people. They were philosophers and mathematicians and artists and poets and composers, people who were known around the world. And what the Nazis really didn't want was people asking lots of questions about where are these people, what's going on with them, why haven't we heard from so-and-so, why hasn't so-and-so been in touch with us or replied, and so on. Because these weren't just ordinary people that nobody would know about, these were really prominent people. And so that was their big fear. They didn't want people asking questions. They wanted to hurry up and kill as many Jews as they could before anybody realized what they were doing. But of course, after going to Terezin, the Red Cross then said, well, we've heard from other reports that you are sending trainloads and trainloads of people, thousands of them, east. Nobody knew what Auschwitz was. They didn't know it existed. They thought it was a labor camp that they were being sent to east. And so the Red Cross said, well, if we can see this one, and this is good, then can we go and see the labor camps? Oh, yes, we'll arrange it, And that's why this special camp was set up. But of course, they never went. And so it was never discovered. I mean, the tragedy is that it came out after the war, that the concentration camps and the gas chambers were known about since 1943, and killings were known, and they were people who risked their lives, enormous bravery, to report what was happening there, and to get the information first to the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope, and ultimately to governments. But it wasn't believed. Or if it was believed, people didn't know how on earth they were going to respond to it.
A real quick one, I might have missed it, but what happened to Fredy?
I don't say.
Oh, you can't say, sorry.
No, I can't. I could say, but I don't say, because I want you to know and love him like I do through the book, and I want you to see what happened to him. There's 2 possible alternatives also, and I know which I believe, but I want you to make up your own mind, and I leave those possibilities open.
This is sort of going away from the book, but you mentioned before that you'd...
Sorry, I'm a little hard of hearing.
Oh, sorry. You'd mentioned before that you'd ghost-written memoirs for other people.
Yes.
Have you ever thought of doing your own?
No. When you're a journalist, you're told to be impartial, and you're taught, it's drummed into you that your name should never come into it other than on the byline. You never use the word I, unless it's a really deeply moving feature about something. So it's not about me. I've had a fascinating, wonderful, sometimes very difficult life, like all of us. I've probably seen more dead bodies than most people are meant to see, and I've seen more torture chambers and burial pits and things, and they will live with me forever, as they should, but they are the memories that I draw upon when I'm writing about those things in a way that moves me when I'm writing about it, and according to my readers, it moves them too. So if that is the price I had to pay, then it's worth paying. Thank you, good question.
There's one at the back. Familiar man.
You mentioned earlier that a lady helped decorate one of the barracks for the children from a rather drab place. I wonder if history tells us whatever happened to her
Yes,
after the war.
Dina was amazing. She was the one that was desperate to become a Disney cartoonist. And actually, it was a difficult situation for Fredy because, as I said, she ended up having to work for Mengele in the end and paint these gypsies and so on. And it was a difficult thing for her to do because she knew that the gypsies were all going to be exterminated. And she was sitting in front of men, women and children, painting them their portraits, knowing what was going to happen to them. So it must have been very hard for her. But because of Fredy and because of that work that she was doing for Mengele, she was saved. And guess what? She went to America and became a Disney cartoonist. She married a Disney cartoonist, she became a Disney cartoonist, she worked for him for years and years and years, and she only died about 20 years ago, and was beautiful and lovely and had the most amazing positive outlook again, another great, and again spoke about Fredy. And she was actually the first person in those Shoah Foundation videos, she was the first person to talk about Fredy's sexuality. And she said, we knew he was gay, and it didn't matter a jot to us because it was not part of what was happening there. It wasn't important. And she said, and I'm only saying it because, and she was talking this in the early 1990s or late 1980s, she said, I'm only saying this because I think that very often homosexuals are denigrated. And she said, and I think when you find somebody who's just essentially very, very good, who's a wonderful person, almost a saint to us, she said, I think we should say that he too is wonderful and he too is a very human person. And I think now is the time for us to stop branding people for what sexual preference they may have. And that was a really brave thing for her to say, and she continued to say it to the day she died. And I'm grateful to her for that because, you know, Fredy was denigrated for so long and forgotten. And people, sometimes in Poland, when I've talked to people in Poland, they said, oh, Fredy Hirsch, he had relations with SS officers. No, he didn't. He didn't. There was one SS officer who paid the ultimate price, you'll read in the book, for helping Fredy, but he helped Fredy because he'd fallen in love with a young Jewish girl who worked in the children's barrack, and he wanted to save her life. So there were moments of humanity there, and he actually had been forced into the SS. He was Romanian, he wasn't German. He'd been forced into the SS. His mother told him that if he didn't do it, he would probably end up on the Russian front, which is an argument for a lot of them, that they said that if they didn't join the SS, they'd go to the Russian front as in the Wehrmacht, and that was almost certain death. And so she wanted to save him, and she made him go into the SS, but when he got to Auschwitz, he was absolutely horrified by what he'd seen, and he tried to do everything he could. There were a lot of them that were kind like that, and they were working with the resistance, and they absented themselves from doing some of the terrible, terrible tasks. You know, it's a difficult thing, isn't it? I often think about Mengele because he'd taken the Hippocratic Oath. He was a doctor who was dedicated, supposedly, to saving people. And I often wonder what would have happened if the war hadn't happened. Would he have just been ordinary? Would he have just carried on being a doctor and helping people and saving people? But something happened to him, and he made a choice. He made a choice to be in the SS, to rise through the ranks, and he made a choice to use his position to his own advantage, despite the unspeakable cruelty and inhumanity of it. And just like Fredy made a choice not to be a bystander to hate, he made a choice to be an architect of hate. And that's what I say to these children, and I said it to them this morning. Each of you has a choice. You're not predestined to be one thing or the other. You are sitting here now with children of every colour, creed, and religion and race, and you have a choice to be exceptional. You have a choice to stand up for somebody. If you see somebody being bullied or being prejudiced against, you have the choice to do something. So make that choice. You know, Jews have a wonderful expression. It's hope is a candle in the darkness, and from a single candle, a million candles can be lit. And I love that. And we're candles, really. You know what? That's what we're here for. You're interested in this because you're candles, because you have a belief that this is important. And actually, I brought out this book in the worst possible time to be discussing anything Jewish. And it's been so lovely how well it's been received. So I often say to people, go home and light a candle for hope.
You mentioned about your school's work. I'm interested to know the children that you're talking to. What is their level of awareness and what's their response after you speak to them?
The children at schools?
Yes.
In schools, yeah. I only speak to year 9 and above because I think it's, and I also temper it. You know, I don't say some of the things that I talk about in Born Survivors and some of the things that happened there. But they are, I mean, for a full hour today, as with every single time I go, you can hear a pin drop. They're absolutely transfixed. I mean, they were all girls. I have to say it does help with girls in the audience. I don't get as much engagement in boys. They seem to be less attentive in many ways and a little fidgety, and I don't know. And it's the girls always that come up to ask the questions, and it's the girls that buy the books more. You know, they're very keen to buy the books for Granny or their mum or somebody, which is lovely. But I really would like to engage more teenage boys because I think they're in trouble. And I'm really worried about teenage boys, and I would love to get more of them on board. So I do workshops in schools as well about taking a career in writing and what that can mean, and how everybody has the ability to do it, but they must read, and of course children aren't reading as much as they used to, if at all, in many cases. They're reading that, but they're not reading a book. So we try to encourage reading as well. It's a really big thing, because you can't really be a writer unless you're a reader. And also, it teaches you the world. You can travel around the world in a book. And, you know, if they feel like they're stuck at home, and, I mean, COVID was dreadful for teenagers, wasn't it? It was really horrible for them. When I think what I got up to in my teenage years, there's somebody at the back who I'm reunited with after 50 years tonight, and he's just turned up tonight. And, yes, he's reminded me how some of the things we got up to in our teenage years, and they were, you know, they were good fun. But I don't know, I think children these days they're going down a rabbit hole and we can't necessarily follow them. And I'd like to get them out of the rabbit hole. I'd like to get Fredy to get them out of the rabbit hole. Get them out walking and bird watching and looking at the trees and feeling the rain on their face and all the things that Fredy did. Fredy taught them meditation. He taught them to lie very still and very quiet and pretend that their bellies were full, or that they weren't hungry or thirsty, and that they would soon be home and sitting down at their Sabbath table suppers, you know. He taught them how, I mean, it seems like such a modern day thing, meditation, but he taught them to do that. And they were practices that they maintained throughout their lives. Wonderful man.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw a thought in, because I have the... I'm going to Auschwitz at the end of this month, actually, to go and visit. And so when I go there, will there be a block, a barrack, still with the paintings on the walls?
No, the children's block was destroyed. So after the war, the communists, their idea was to raze Auschwitz to the ground, to forget it ever happened, and to build a town there. And the world leaders said, no, you won't be doing that. This is a site of permanent memorial. 6 million people died there, not just Jews, homosexuals, Catholics, anybody who wouldn't say Heil Hitler, basically. And gypsies, of course, terrible Sinti, the Sinti tribes, the Romas. And so it had to be preserved. But in the course of those long-term negotiations, which took several years, many of the barracks were destroyed. Actually, some of them were destroyed literally by local people who were suffering terribly, had suffered terribly during the war, and who wanted to just dismantle them because they needed the wood for fires or they needed to build something for themselves. And the others were razed to the ground by the Nazis. But you can see certainly barracks that were like that, the horse barracks you can see, the ones that don't have any windows, that have got the very high ceilings. That is exactly what the children's block looked like. And if you ask them where the children's block was, they will point to you where that particular camp was. B2B, B2B.
Any last questions from the audience? I get nothing from the virtual crowd. You guys very quiet. If not, we'll finish there. Listen, it's been an absolute honour to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Wendy Holden.